What did the first version of macOS 10 look like in 2001? Let's go and find out. So if we enter the TARDIS that is my shed, we'll find my iMac G3. Okay, so here we are on my iMac. This is macOS 9.2. I have to tell the truth, it's actually an emulator. Here we go, here's the macOS 10.1 install CD. Look how that window was the perfect size. All I had to see was the only folder that I need to see really. But I'm going to resize it anyway. Okay, so I just click on this and then it's just a simple button, restart. So the machine has now rebooted, and the first sign that we are now in the future, that is macOS 10, is the beach ball cursor in the top left. So we're just going to wait now, and here we go, this is macOS 10, and look at that, doesn't that look modern? So we can see here the menus, so we have beautiful looking translucent menus, and we're only in the installer, we haven't actually loaded the operating system yet. Okay, so I'm going to go through this wizard now, some information, accept the license agreement, and I should be able to install it onto the same disk as macOS 9. That will mean that I can keep all of my classic applications and I'll even be able to run them from within macOS 10. So we are going to install this now. So here we are at the boot screen and we can see all of the things that macOS has to do when it boots up. Back then, of course, it would have to wait for one to finish before it could do the next. And so like, for example, here, starting directory services, that might be waiting on something on the network. It will have to time out. And so nothing else could happen until that had finished. In a few later iterations of macOS 10, these processes could all be started in parallel, so that dramatically improved boot time. But at the time, this was quite novel actually, because it reminded you that you were actually using what was essentially a fully powered Unix workstation. macOS 9 in comparison was almost like a baby operating system compared to macOS 10. And if, like me, you'd come from Windows 98, then having full preemptive multitasking and rock solid reliability was quite a novelty. Okay, so here we are in the installer. We need to pick our country. So I'm going to pick the country I'm in, which is the United Kingdom. I'm going to choose the British settings. And now I need to register. Interesting that there doesn't seem to be an obvious way to skip this process, although we do have some nice translucent error messages if we try. So I'm going to put some information in here. No idea why they need to know my company or school. And what if I don't have a company or school? But there you go, that was 2001, I guess. Okay, so where will I primarily use this computer? Home, and I'm a web designer. Okay, now I need to pick my account. I'm going to choose Mark. I'm not going to set a password, it's going to warn me about that. But yeah, hey, we're in 2001. What's there to worry about? Now we need to set up our internet service. Hopefully it will pick up my local area network. Back in the day, of course, I would have been on a modem. Let's see what happens here. Lovely animation. Disconnecting. Okay, my registration could not be sent. That's not surprising. I'm sure Apple shut down those servers many years ago. Now it wants me to set up email. I don't want to do that, so I'm going to press Control Q like I just did, and we're going to skip this. There was no obvious way to skip it. Interestingly, you had to know about the Command Q. Okay, so here I am now. I've actually gone and changed the wallpaper and changed a few settings already. I was just messing about to make sure it was working. So here we are in macOS 10, and wow, isn't that the future? So just remember that back in 2001. If you'd used a computer before, you'd probably been using Windows 98, Mac OS 9, probably something even older like Mac OS 8 or Windows 95. If your company was relatively modern, you might have been using Windows 2000 or NT, but this beautiful animations, smooth animations, you didn't even get that in games at the time. So this really was a huge step into the future. So let's have a look at some of the settings we can change here. So these are the various backgrounds. I remember using these backgrounds myself on the old iMac. Isn't that great? I think that photo might have been taken by Steve Jobs. I'm sure I remember reading that somewhere. Let me know if I've got that wrong. Okay, so here is the system preferences, and as you can see, it looks pretty much the same as it does in recent versions of macOS, although in the latest beta it has actually been completely redesigned. But it's amazing to think that this design lasted for 21 years. Okay, so let's take a tour of the system preferences. Of course, in the old version of macOS 10.0, you'd go to Finder Preferences to change your background. But in 10.1 they moved it into the general system preferences. Okay, so let's go and look at our dock settings, why not? Interestingly, just noticed it says system prefs up there rather than system preferences. Okay, so dock preferences, so you've got your dock size. I've got magnification turned on. You can also click at on the divider, and you could hold down the Option key to switch between the set icon sizes. If you didn't hold down the Option key, then it would scale naturally between the sizes like so. I remember back in the day I would try and use one of the set sizes in the probably mistaken belief that it would improve performance somehow. I remember also having magnification turned on because that was just such a cool effect. You could put the dock on either side of the screen or at the bottom. And of course you could scale it to be as big or as small as you wanted it. There were a number of different animation effects as well. So we have the genie effect and we have the scale effect, and this is the genie effect in slow motion, and that still exists today in macOS 10 or macOS 11 as I believe it's called now. At the time though, that did sometimes struggle on lower power machines like mine, and so the scale effect was often recommended as a way to minimize windows more quickly and while using fewer CPU cycles, because this was back in the day when all of this compositing was done on the CPU. It wasn't done on the GPU. In fact, it wouldn't be done on the GPU until I think 10.3 when Quartz Extreme was introduced. So I prefer the scale effect. So let's continue then. So we can add some favorites into our toolbar. It's interesting that back then, you know, the idea that you might have favorite system preferences was apparently a thing. I think the thinking these days is that you hopefully don't have to go and change preferences to options, so you wouldn't need a favorite. Appearance settings, so you could have your classic blue or graphite. That would control the color of the widgets in the operating system. So you've got the traffic light colors in the top left, the close, minimize, and maximize button. And I used to use graphite, I think, back in the day because it gave me this feeling of being a pro. And it was for quite a while, I think. These were the only two options. It was only in the last couple of years that Apple finally introduced additional color options. Although the color of the traffic light icons or widgets in the top left of the window, they stay the same unless you choose graphite. Okay, let's go back and look at some other preferences. So international, so you've got everything you'd expect here for changing, for example, the number layout, the time format, etc. You've got login preferences here. So this is where you could choose items that would start automatically. So let's say I've got this app here. This is the Windows Media Player installer. If for some reason I wanted that to launch on startup, I could drag it in here. Now this would usually be for things like your email client or your Messenger application or internet relay chat, things that you genuinely would want to actually run on startup. And then the option to automatically log in, that I think is still possible, but buried away. I don't think that's really recommended anymore. And then some options around whether or not you want to display the login window as a list of users, which would be most common for most people, or you could let somebody enter any username they like, which was more useful if you're in a school or something where there's going to be lots of users or maybe even network users wanting to log on. Okay, so we are now in the screensaver preferences. Now, this early on in macOS, most of the screensavers were pretty boring. They were mostly just cycling through various images that were also desktop wallpapers. I think with the exception of the Aqua Icon screensaver, it wouldn't be for another couple of years that the Flurry screensaver would be released. And that, of course, remains a classic Mac screensaver to these days. So we've got activation, we've got hot corners, all features that are still available today in macOS. Okay, on to the next preference. So universal access. This has been renamed now to accessibility, and I think the new name makes much more sense. Never quite understood what universal access meant back in the day, but now I guess it makes more sense to me. And there were some useful features here, and I think macOS was for a long time a long way behind Windows in terms of just being able to navigate the operating system by keyboard, but there were some options there. Color sync, that's pretty boring. Displays, so this was my resolution I would use on the iMac back in the day, 1024 by 768. Obviously I'm in a virtual machine at the moment, so I have more options available to me. Energy saver. So to this day, Macs still sleep far more reliably than Windows laptops. I have a Dell XPS machine which I use for work. It's only a couple of years old, and like clockwork, if I put it to sleep, it will wake up in the middle of the night or even a couple of hours later, fans whirling, heat seeping from my bag, just terrible. Whereas Macs generally are pretty reliable when it comes to sleeping. So the classic options here, you've got how long would you like it to wait before sleeping, separate times for display sleep, separate times for the hard disk. I was never quite sure back in the day whether having the hard disk go to sleep and wake up all the time was a good thing. Like you could be sat using your computer just listening to music, for example, and the hard disk, because the music was in memory, the hard disk wasn't needed, so you'd hear it click down and go to sleep, especially in the iMac G3 because it had no fan, so the hard disk was the only noise you really heard, to be honest. So I was never quite sure if it was adding wear and tear, but I guess the fact that Apple provided an option meant that it was probably okay and did actually save power. But there we go. Okay, some other options here. Waking for admin access. So back in the day, I was on a modem, wasn't really on a network. I connect to the internet via a modem, so there was no real need for that for me. So keyboard and mouse options, I think I'll probably skip past those. I do remember, I'll have a quick look. I do remember actually using the Apple Pro mouse at the time that came with the iMac. It was awful. One button, very limited. Within 2 weeks, I think I'd gone out and bought a Microsoft IntelliMouse. Much better. Okay, where shall we go next? Okay, these are the sound options. Not much of interest in there. Now let's take a look at the internet settings. So iTools it was the equivalent to, I guess, iCloud. I'm going to cover up my details here. So we set our email client up here. Interestingly, I think the idea was that for like your email and web settings, that you'd set them in the system preferences and then applications could read them in. So you would just set up your mail details centrally, and then if an application wanted to offer the ability to check your email, it could go and query those details from the operating system. Same here, if you installed a new web browser, then in theory it could just pull your homepage details and preferences and download locations, etc. from the system. I kind of like that idea, this idea that it's a bit more user-centric, like you have a preference. But I guess in reality, you might want to have a different homepage for Chrome than you do for Firefox, for example, if you want to keep work and home separate. So it didn't really last. Here we go, news. So when we say news, what they actually mean here is they mean Usenet. So Usenet or NNTP, I think that was Network News Protocol or something. Usenet was a discussion forum system. It was great back in the day, but it was often called news. Like you pay for news to your ISP for news services, whereas now I think if you pay for news, you're kind of probably paying for the New York Times or something. Okay, network settings. Not much of interest here. I guess the ability to connect an AppleTalk network. Back in the day, I didn't really use this because, as I said, I was connecting using a modem. Okay, and back to the settings. QuickTime. Interesting that QuickTime was considered so important that it had its own setting in the system preferences. Now sharing. Now here, there's some quite cool things really. So you could have file sharing, that was pretty standard for operating systems, but web sharing, the fact that every iMac sold in 2001 was also a web server is pretty cool. And it wasn't just a Mickey Mouse web server, it was actually running Apache, which was beginning to, or had become quite commonplace back then. Obviously not as commonplace as it is now. So I've just turned on web sharing, so I should be able to navigate to localhost. And if we're lucky, yes we are, we can see the Apache start page. So this kind of harks back to this idea of the early internet, which maybe I romanticize a bit, but this idea that anybody who had a computer, they would connect their computer to the network and it could offer services. They could have their own website, they could be part of the internet. Whereas now, although we have a lot of self-publishing services, there's lots of social media, you're kind of always posting to someone else's server. And in fact, even if you wanted to run a very simple website, you probably would not run it on your own machine in your bedroom or in the living room, in the corner of the living room, as I guess could have been potentially perceived, might have happened back then. Okay, so let's have a look at the Finder. So you've got the sites there. So sites, if we take a look at the icon there, this is the root directory of our Apache web server. You'll notice that the directory for sites has a custom icon like pictures and music. And a little tidbit for you that to this day, if you create a directory called sites in your home directory, it has to have an uppercase S, I believe, then you'll get a custom icon for it, even in the latest version of macOS. And the same can be said for developer as well. So whatever bit of code that is in the operating system that provides a custom icon based on the directory name, it's been there since version 1 by the looks of it, and it's still in the operating system now, which is pretty cool. So this is where we would edit our HTML files if we wanted to publish something on the internet. On my 56k modem, as it would have been back in the day. I'm pretty sure I did actually do that, just because I could. And I remember sending the link to some friends with my IP address saying, hey, look at my website. FTP access. Does anybody here know what FTP means? That was a way of transferring files back in the day. I guess it's been surpassed now by HTTP. Remote login. Now, I don't know whether this under the hood would have been Telnet or whether it would have been SSH, the secure version of Telnet. I don't know. I know SSH was invented around this time. It was a thing, but I don't know if it was commonplace then. So here I am back at the desktop, and I'm just going to have a play around with some of the apps that I used to use when I was 16-year-old me back in the year 2001 on my Snow iMac. So this is preview. Do I have any files I can actually open with preview? Probably not. Let's try and find a file that I could open. Okay, so I'm now in text edit. Now what I wanted to show you was that if I put the window below the dock, you see it kind of moves itself back up above the dock so it won't get stuck behind the dock. Whereas the Finder window does not do that. So that was an indicator back in the day. It was a way that you could tell whether an application was built using Carbon or built using Cocoa. Now, Cocoa apps like TextEdit were using the more modern API, whereas Carbon applications like the Finder, they were ported across from macOS 9, and so they weren't aware of things like the dock. Okay, let's open up Microsoft Office now. So the first application that I'm interested in, I think, is going to be the email client. So interestingly, there was no Microsoft Outlook for the Mac. Instead, you had Microsoft Entourage, and of course you have the other applications such as Microsoft Word, Microsoft Excel, and PowerPoint. And now just take a moment to look at how cool and funky those icons were. I always feel like the Office Mac team had a little bit more license to have a bit of fun and really employ some talented graphic designers to come up with some decent icons. If you look at the icons that they were using for Windows version of Office back in the day, it was kind of pretty boring. In fact, even today, fortunately, they have the same icons across every platform now because of brand consistency, I guess. Okay, so we're in Entourage. Which was the equivalent of Outlook, but it was just like had a nice Mac spin on it. It was quite cool, really, the fact there was this Mac only piece of software. And I think possibly the reason for the differentiation was I don't think Entourage worked very well or played well with Exchange servers. I seem to remember that. So I guess perhaps it was to avoid confusion with customers who thought that Outlook obviously is going to work with Exchange, whereas I don't seem to remember that this did. But there we go. So no preview pane by default, pretty odd. This is the welcome email, very text heavy. Can you imagine getting an email like this, welcoming you to your new piece of software, and it's about 1,000 words? But there we are. And this is the calendar application, or the calendar section of Entourage. Looks pretty good for a calendar of 2001. So I'm going to create an appointment now. So I need to type a subject, I think. So let's do that first. Okay, so I think what I want to see is if I can get a reminder to come up. So I'm going to try and do that. So let's put the subject in here. Let's change it to today's date. And where's the time? For some reason I can't pick a time. It's because it's an all-day event. Okay, so let's pick a time that's going to be in the near future. So it's 8 minutes past 5 now. So let's set it for 2 minutes time. I guess that means we have to be quick because it's going to remind us 1 minute before. So I'm going to quickly, shall I invite somebody? No, no, that's not going to work. Okay, let's close it and we'll see if, and there we go, there's our reminder. So reminders were implemented by having another application just pop up into the dock by the looks of it. Look at that, Office notifications. It says something about the design aesthetic back then, that the title of the window is the most prominent piece of information there, not the name of your appointment or the time or anything. Office notification. So you could be busy typing along, getting on with your work, and then suddenly something starts launching in your dock, and you know a few seconds beforehand that you've got a notification coming up. In fact, I remember this because it would take a good sort of 20 or 30 seconds to actually launch because the Mac was so slow back then. But actually, beyond a few aesthetic details, that isn't too different from how Outlook works now, to be honest. So let's have another look at Excel. So this is Microsoft Excel. So why don't we go and look at some of the templates we have here. Oh, not much of interest. Okay, let's just open a blank document then. Okay, and this was Excel. You know, this was the future of spreadsheets at the time. And it's a Carbon application. Doesn't pop up. Still looks pretty good though, I think, for 2001 software. So I'm going to try and put a formula in here. Oh, it doesn't like that. Is it because the column's too... No. It's rand, isn't it? Not random, of course. There we go. So there we go. We've put a formula into Microsoft Excel. And this was Excel version X. I think the version X came from the fact that at the time there was Office XP to go with Windows XP maybe. Although XP had not been released at this time. Office XP was released a year later, I believe. So maybe Office XP took inspiration from this. I don't know actually. Okay, I'm going to try and put a chart in now. So I'm just going to put some dummy data in. Okay, so I've got labels on the left, values on the right. So now if I go to, I think the insert menu, where's chart? Chart. Ah, there it is. Okay, so we want to choose an option now. I'm going to go for the 100% stacked. Okay, let's have a look, see what that looks like. And there we go. Although I'm not quite sure why all those bars are the same height, but maybe it's because they don't know what, it doesn't know what the percentage is out of, maybe, I guess. Maybe I need to have two values. But anyway, you can see the charts there. They don't look particularly great, I don't think. They kind of look more at home on Windows 95 than they do Mac OS 10. And I seem to remember at the time I had the AppleWorks suite, which was the precursor to iWorks. It was called AppleWorks, and it was kind of like a monolithic application, everything all in one. Okay, so let's try and save this. You'll notice it's the XLS file format, the binary file format. This was 6 years, I believe, before Microsoft would introduce their XML formats, which were essentially zip files with a bunch of XML documents in them and all of the supporting resources like images and what have you. But here we're working with binary files, which still to this day can be opened in Microsoft Office. Okay, now Microsoft Word. Okay, let's open up. Should we just do blank document again? Okay, here we go. Right, so this was how I used to type up most of my homework actually on this screen. So I'd have my formatting palette over on the right, which was a little bit different to how it worked on Windows. With Windows, you would have many rows of toolbars. In fact, that eventually led Microsoft to invent the ribbon. I actually think this idea of just having formatting bars on the right, or palettes on the right, is much more space efficient. You could, of course, customize the toolbars, and you could actually make it look a little bit like Windows by Windows version of Office by adding more and more toolbars. So, and you could close the formatting palette. So if you wanted to feel home on Windows, you could do that. But I kind of embraced this Mac way of working at the time, and I'm pretty sure Pages and Numbers still to this day use this idea of kind of like a sidebar. It's not a palette anymore, it's part of the main window. But especially on widescreen monitors, it makes much more sense. Okay, let's put some word art in, because whose school project wasn't complete without some word art? My school report. To think we thought this looked good at some point. There we go. Let's make it a little bit transparent. Not noticing any different. It seems to just be making it grey. I seem to remember that the transparency option was exclusive to Word on the Mac or Office X. At the time, I don't believe the Windows counterpart had anything like that. Okay, so we're in the Mail app now. So the Mail app has a problem, I think because I had a crash earlier on, and it can't open the .mbox file. So interestingly, the original version of Mail, like Outlook still does to this day, used a monolithic file to store all of your email in, which was of course prone to corruption, as is Outlook today. Whereas Mail has, for many years now, it has got moved to the system of having each individual email as its own file on the file system, which I think was done to make Spotlight indexing easier, but it also has a side effect of making it far more reliable too. So this is the Mail app. So you can see here we are in version 1.1 of Mail app, and I've got one email, hello from 2022. Now, if we wanted to take a look at the email, now I've covered up a few of personal details, but you can see here still supports an image that I pasted in from my Mac, my modern Mac. So that's pretty cool. I'm looking at an email sent from the future. So this is the clock app. So the clock app was so cool because it was transparent. You could have a movie playing and then you could have the clock overlaid across it and you could see through the clock and see the movie playing. Okay, so let's look at iTunes. So this is iTunes on macOS 10.1, the version that came with it, and I am pretty sure that the version we're looking at here is using the same code base that is still in use today in the Music app on modern Macs. So one giveaway of that is that the preferences dialog we're looking at now is modal. So that means if you try to click into the main window while the preferences dialog is active, you won't be able to. And of course we have brushed metal. Now, when I look at this now, it looks extremely dated to me. Like, I think for the rest of macOS 10.1, if you were to put this operating system out there in the world today, if it had not been for the fact that someone else did it 20 years ago, then I don't think people would laugh. I think they would think this is actually, you know, a reasonable, pretty good design. However, if somebody put this brushed metal application out there today, I think they might get laughed at. Also notice that when we tried to resize the window just there was an outline. It didn't do live resizing, so something, I'm not quite sure why that was. Maybe they couldn't do the brush metal animation smoothly. That was, of course, fixed at some point. But yeah, iTunes. I remember sat listening to music on my Mac, procrastinating when I should have been doing homework. I'd be listening to the likes of Manic Street Preachers, Suede, Oasis, ELO, all the classics from back then. Pretty much what I listen to now, to be honest. Let's try to browse the web with Internet Explorer. Love that splash screen, by the way. And now, most modern websites won't work, and that's because most websites now will require transport layer security, which was a thing back then, although I think it was called SSL in 2001. However, the encryption protocols that we use are now much stronger, and the ones that we used in 2001 are not considered secure. So a lot of websites won't even allow you to connect using an insecure algorithm. If they did, like I think Google does, then it wouldn't be an issue. So Google, I think, will work, which to their credit, I guess it's not the end of the world if someone sees your searches, maybe. So yeah, Google still works on a 2001 operating system. Isn't that pretty cool? So we've clicked on the header there. This is an information page about Anne Frank. So we can have a look here, scroll down. All seems to look, you know, pretty good. It doesn't look as good as it would on a modern web browser. I'm guessing that the latest CSS, well, obviously the latest CSS standards are not going to be supported in Internet Explorer. Although I seem to remember it was the Jasmine rendering engine that was used, not the Trident engine that was used on Windows. And the Jasmine engine was far more compliant with web standards than the Windows equivalent of Internet Explorer. So the other links are not working. I'm guessing they have higher standards for security. You know, you don't want people to see your Gmail, for example, or maybe they're just run by different development teams, who knows. So toolbars, we could customize our toolbar. So can't browse the web, but at least I can customize the toolbar, and we just do that by dragging and dropping icons. We could also change the browser color as well, which was pretty cool. So the idea here, which I think was pretty cool of Microsoft to do, considering that Apple were, you know, a rival at the time, but you could make your browser match your iMac color, which I thought was amazing. So I had a Snow iMac, but often I just run it in a funky color because I wanted to. And this was kind of like a precursor to being able to theme your browser, although I think at the time Netscape 6 had already been released, so that was a thing. However, these do look like they've been designed by professional graphics designers, unlike a lot of the themes you get for web browsers even these days. If you stray too far from the defaults, it just looks kind of ridiculous in my opinion. Whereas I actually think the Internet Explorer there looks pretty good. Okay, I'm going to look now at Real Basic. So Real Basic was like the equivalent of Visual Basic 6 for Macs, and it came bundled with Office, and it's kind of something that I miss actually. Not specifically Real Basic, but the ability to quickly put together a visual application without a lot of thought or a lot of experience. So that idea of rapid application development, this idea that you could just kind of like drag and drop a few controls onto a form, double click on them, whack some code in, and you got something up and running. It was that simple. And that kind of went away for a long time, and I think that maybe Swift UI is a return to that. Like, it's this idea that the best way to learn something sometimes is to just dive in and start using it. And then as you mature, as you get better, if you want to go professional, then it's time to start learning about the proper way to do it. Because obviously, you know, I don't advocate writing deep proper software in Visual Basic 6. Okay, that's not worked. Okay, I think it's the parenthesis. So weird syntax of Visual Basic or Real Basic was that you only needed parentheses if you were returning a value from a function. Let's see if that works. It does, pretty good, although it doesn't seem to have any of the window controls. But there we go. Okay, let's have a look at some other applications. So I'm going to look at the utilities folder, which still exists today in macOS. So a lot of the applications you'll notice are the same. I think Apple System Profiler has been renamed to something else, but essentially the same application exists. You've got Grab, which I think is now called Screenshot. Activity Viewer or Activity Monitor, I forget what it's called now, but that was called Process Viewer at the time. Similar icon, but back then it was just a list of processes essentially. I do seem to remember there was a CPU meter actually. CPU monitor, there we go. So this would let you see how your single CPU core was doing. And I remember that if you were to drag a window around the screen too vigorously, the CPU would max out 100% because this was before the days of GPU rendered. The Quartz compositor was not GPU rendered. Okay, so let's open up the terminal. Let's see if we can find out how much memory is in use. So first of all, I'm going to just try and see what our uptime is. There we go, 31 minutes. Now if I type the top command, this should give me a readout of everything that's running. And if you look at, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows down, you've got physmem, physical memory, so 42 megabytes wired. So that's memory that can't be paged out. 68.5 megabytes active that's currently being used, and then you've got both inactive and used. So that's memory that's full of something, but could be replaced with something else if needed. So quite a lot of our memory is in use of our 512. We've got 99 megabytes free, but most of it, if needed, could just be discarded and then replaced with something else. So that actually looks pretty healthy, I think. It's pretty cool that, you know, if you look at my dock, I have a lot of applications running, and this would not be uncommon for me back in the day on my G3 iMac. So that is my exploration of macOS 10.1. We've gone on a journey from macOS 9.2, we've installed 10.1, and if you're interested, like this video, and maybe I will do another video where we upgrade this 10.1 installation to 10.2. Thank you so much for watching.